"You're a useless burden," my daughter-in-law said. 2 weeks later, I inherited a fortune from an aunt I never even knew existed. Now she wants to be my best friend. They told me I was just taking up space, and maybe they were right. Those words came out of my daughter-in-law's mouth like poison 3 weeks ago, and I've been carrying them around in my chest ever since, feeling them burn every time I breathe. Sarah didn't even look at me when she said it. She was standing in my kitchen that I've been tending for 43 years, running her finger along the counter like she was checking for dust, finding fault in everything I've spent my life building. I'm 68 years old, and I've been a widow for 3 years now. 3 years since Harold passed and left me in this house that suddenly feels too big and too quiet and too full of memories that nobody else seems to care about anymore. The house where we raised our son Michael, where we celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and holidays, where Harold taught Michael how to tie his shoes and fix a leaky faucet and be a decent man. Or at least I thought he'd learned how to be a decent man. Sarah moved in 6 months ago. Well, she didn't exactly move in, but she's here every damn day, making lists and suggestions and pointed comments about how much this old place costs to maintain. She's been married to my Michael for 5 years, and in all that time, I've tried to love her like a daughter. I really have. But love isn't something you can force, and respect sure as hell isn't something you can fake forever. The fight started over something stupid. It always does, doesn't it? I was watering my herb garden, the one my grandmother taught me to tend when I was barely tall enough to reach the basil. Sage and rosemary, thyme and lavender, chamomile and mint. Each plant placed exactly where the morning sun hits just right, exactly where the afternoon shade protects them from getting burned. I've been growing these same herbs in this same spot for decades, learning their moods and needs, like you learn a person's heartbeat when you sleep next to them long enough. Sarah came storming out of the house holding my electric bill like it was evidence in a murder trial. $78 for electricity last month, Margaret. $78 for one person living alone. Do you know what our apartment costs us? Do you have any idea what Michael and I are sacrificing so you can keep playing house in this museum? Playing house. Like everything I've built here, everything I've nurtured and protected and loved was just some kind of game. Like the 46 years Harold and I spent in this place meant nothing. Like the roots I've grown in this soil were just for show. I kept watering my plants because I didn't trust my voice yet. The anger was rising up in me like heat shimmer off summer pavement, and I knew if I spoke too soon, I'd say something I couldn't take back. Michael was at work, of course. He's always at work when these conversations happen. I wonder sometimes if that's on purpose, if he schedules his life around avoiding the hard moments, the uncomfortable truths, the choices that might require him to pick a side. "I pay my own bills, Sarah," I said finally, keeping my voice level. "I've been paying my own bills since before you were born." She laughed. Actually laughed. Standing there in her designer workout clothes that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month, laughing at me like I was a child who'd said something cute and naive. "With what money, Margaret? Your Social Security barely covers your medication. Michael's been quietly supplementing everything for months. The property taxes, the insurance, the repairs when the hot water heater died last winter. Did you think that money just appeared out of thin air?" I did know, actually. I'm old. Not stupid. I'd noticed the checks, the way Michael would casually mention that he'd taken care of this bill or that repair. I'd noticed, and I'd been grateful, and I'd also been slowly dying inside, because being grateful for your own son taking care of you feels like swallowing glass when you used to be the one doing all the taking care of. But hearing it laid out like that, like evidence of my inadequacy, like proof that I'd become exactly what every aging parent fears becoming, a burden, a responsibility, a problem to be managed, that was different. That cut deeper than I was prepared for. "I didn't ask him to do any of that," I said, and my voice cracked just enough that she could hear it, just enough that she could smell the weakness. "No, you didn't ask. You just exist here, using up resources, taking up space, making everything more complicated than it needs to be. This house is too big for you. This garden is too much work for someone your age. Hell, Margaret, you fell off that stepladder last month reaching for the top shelf, and what if nobody had been here? What if you'd broken a hip Or hit your head? Or... But I didn't. But you could have. You could have. And then what? Then Michael would be dealing with emergency rooms and nursing homes and all the horrible decisions that come when someone refuses to admit they can't take care of themselves anymore. Refuses to admit. Like my independence was some kind of delusion. Like wanting to stay in my own home, tend my own garden, live my own life was just stubbornness disguised as dignity. I set down my watering can and really looked at her for the first time in that conversation. Really looked at her face, trying to see past the frustration and the impatience to whatever was driving all this sudden urgency about my living situation. Sarah's pretty in that sharp, ambitious way that photographs well but doesn't age gracefully. She's 32 and works in marketing for some tech company, always talking about optimizing and streamlining and maximizing efficiency. She approaches life like it's a business plan that needs constant revision. What do you want me to do, Sarah? I want you to be practical. I want you to look around at this place honestly and admit that it's too much. There are beautiful senior communities now, Margaret. Places where you'd have people your own age to talk to, activities planned for you, medical staff on site if anything happens. You could sell this house and actually have money in the bank instead of being a constant drain on your future inheritance? The words came out before I could stop them, and they hung in the air between us like smoke. Sarah's face went red, then white, then red again. We both knew I'd hit something true and ugly and unforgivable. That's not what this is about. Isn't it? Michael loves you. We both love you. But love doesn't pay for new roofing when yours starts leaking, or for the kind of medical care you're going to need as you get older. Love doesn't magically make this house smaller, or your lawn easier to maintain, or your independence less of a liability. Liability. That word hit me like a slap. In one conversation, I'd gone from being Michael's mother to being his liability. From being Harold's widow, trying to honor his memory by keeping our home beautiful, to being an old woman too stubborn to face reality. But here's the thing about being 68 years old. You've lived long enough to know when someone is lying to your face, even when they're lying to themselves too. Sarah wasn't wrong about the money. She wasn't wrong about the house being too big, or the maintenance being expensive, or my age making everything more complicated. But she was wrong about what was driving her need to solve the Margaret problem right now, today, with such urgent desperation. Is there something you're not telling me, Sarah? Some reason this conversation couldn't wait another month or another year? She looked away from me then, focusing on something over my shoulder, like the answer to my question was written on the side of the garage. We're just trying to plan for the future, Margaret. Trying to be responsible adults instead of pretending problems will solve themselves. Responsible adults. Like I hadn't been a responsible adult for longer than she'd been breathing. Like I hadn't raised a son and buried a husband and managed a household and held down jobs and made tough decisions when there were no good choices available. I was about to tell her exactly what I thought about her definition of responsibility when Michael's car pulled into the driveway. My heart did this stupid little flutter of relief, like maybe he could fix whatever was breaking between his wife and his mother. Like maybe he could find some magic words that would make us all love each other again, or at least pretend to. But when he got out of the car, I could see from his face that he already knew what we'd been talking about. There was this guilty, tired look in his eyes that told me he and Sarah had discussed the Margaret situation plenty of times before. That they'd made plans and decisions about my future without bothering to include me in the conversation. Michael looks like his father, especially around the eyes. Same deep brown, same way of looking at you like he's really listening, even when his mind is somewhere else entirely. He's 43 now, old enough to have some gray in his hair and lines around those eyes, old enough to have learned that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. "Hey, Mom," he said, and kissed my cheek like everything was normal. Like his wife hadn't just spent 20 minutes explaining to me why I was too old and too expensive and too much trouble to keep around. "Michael," Sarah said, and her voice had changed completely. Gone was the sharp, impatient tone she'd been using with me. Now she sounded tired and worried, and like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I was just talking to your mom about maybe looking into some senior housing options. Nothing immediate, just, planning ahead. Planning ahead. Like I wasn't standing right there, like I was already gone and they were just managing my estate. Michael looked between us, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to keep everyone happy, how to avoid taking sides, how to navigate the impossible space between loving your mother and keeping your wife satisfied. It's a position no one should have to be in, but it's the position he'd been in for months now, maybe longer. "We don't have to decide anything today," he said carefully. "Maybe we could all sit down this weekend and just talk through some options?" Options. Like my life had become a multiple-choice question with all the wrong answers. "Actually," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded, "I think Sarah's right. I think it's time for me to start planning ahead." They both stared at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. Like the last thing they'd expected was for me to agree with anything Sarah had said. "Mom?" Michael looked confused, maybe a little worried. "You don't have to." "No, I do. I do have to. I'm 68 years old, and I've been living in the past for 3 years, trying to keep everything exactly the way it was when your father was alive. But Harold's gone, and pretending this house doesn't need more than I can give it isn't honoring his memory. It's just being stubborn." Sarah looked like she didn't quite trust this victory, like she was waiting for the catch, the condition, the but that would take away everything she thought she'd won. But there was no but. Not the kind she was expecting anyway. Because what Sarah didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that 2 days earlier, I'd gotten a phone call from a lawyer I'd never heard of, telling me about an inheritance from a great aunt I barely remembered, telling me about a property in rural Montana that had been sitting empty for 5 years, waiting for someone to claim it. What they didn't know was that for the first time in 3 years, I'd spent the night lying awake, not because I was sad or scared or lonely, but because I was planning, really planning, not just surviving from one day to the next. What they didn't know was that tomorrow morning I was driving to Montana to see what my great-aunt Rosemary had left me, and to figure out if a 68-year-old woman who'd been told she was taking up space could maybe find a place where she was supposed to be instead. But I wasn't ready to tell them any of that yet. I wasn't ready to show my cards until I knew exactly what game we were all playing. "I'll start making some calls," I said. "Look into those senior communities you mentioned." Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd given me in months. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad. I really think you're going to love having people around, having activities planned, not having to worry about maintenance and repairs and all that stress." I smiled back at her, and I hope she never finds out what that smile really meant. Because tomorrow, I was going to start taking up space somewhere else entirely. The drive to Montana took me 11 hours, and I spent every mile of it thinking about the last time I'd done something this impulsive. It was 1978, and Harold had gotten it into his head that we should drive to New Orleans for our anniversary instead of going to the usual steakhouse in town. We packed the car on a Friday afternoon and just went, no reservations, no real plan beyond following the highway south until we found something that looked like adventure. That was back when I trusted the future to work itself out. Back when surprises felt like possibilities instead of problems. Now here I was, nearly 47 years later, driving toward another unknown with my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had given me directions to a property outside a town called Clearwater, population 847, according to the sign I'd passed an hour ago. The landscape had been changing gradually as I drove, from the familiar suburbs of home to farmland to something wilder, more untamed. Rolling hills covered in tall grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind, scattered clusters of trees that looked like they'd been placed there by someone with an eye for composition. I'd never heard of Great-Aunt Rosemary until Mr. Peterson called. According to him, she'd been my grandmother's sister, the one who'd moved west in the 1950s and never came back for family reunions or holidays. The one who'd become a story we told at Christmas about the family rebel who'd chosen adventure over stability. Apparently, she'd been keeping track of us even if we'd lost track of her. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until I was driving on what could barely be called a road at all, more like 2 tire tracks with grass growing between them. My little Honda wasn't built for this kind of terrain, and I found myself holding my breath every time the undercarriage scraped against something I couldn't see. And then, just when I was starting to think I'd made a terrible mistake, the trees opened up and I saw it. The house sat in the middle of maybe 20 acres of untamed land, a 2-story farmhouse painted white once upon a time, but now faded to the color of old bones. The porch wrapped around the front and one side, supported by columns that were straight enough, but could probably use some attention. Windows looked out over the property like eyes that had seen too much and learned to keep their secrets. But it was the land that took my breath away. Rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers I couldn't name, a vegetable garden gone wild, but still recognizably organized in neat rows, fruit trees heavy with apples that no one had picked. And everywhere, growing in patches and clusters and careful arrangements, were herbs. Dozens of varieties I recognized, and dozens more I didn't, growing like someone had planned an outdoor pharmacy and then let nature take over the details. I sat in my car for a long time, just looking. This wasn't what I'd expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. Something smaller, maybe. Something more manageable for a woman my age. Something that wouldn't require quite so much courage to claim. The key was exactly where Mr. Peterson had said it would be, under a loose board on the porch steps. The front door opened with the kind of creak that belonged in a movie, and I stepped into a house that smelled like lavender and dust and time. The furniture was old but well made, the kind of solid wood pieces that lasted generations if you took care of them. Doilies on the side tables, quilts folded neatly on the backs of chairs, family photographs in frames that needed dusting. It felt like walking into someone else's memory, someone else's life that had been paused mid-sentence and was waiting for the story to continue. I spent the first hour just wandering, opening cabinets and drawers like I was conducting an archaeological dig. The kitchen was enormous by modern standards, with a cast-iron stove that looked like it could heat the whole house and windows that looked out over the herb gardens. The pantry was lined with empty mason jars and shelves that could hold enough food to feed an army, or at least to get through a long Montana winter. Upstairs, I found 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub deep enough to drown in. The master bedroom had windows on 3 sides and a view that stretched for miles, all the way to mountains that looked like they'd been painted on the horizon with a brush dipped in blue-gray paint. But it was the attic that made me understand why Great-Aunt Rosemary had left this place to me. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed toward a door I almost missed, hidden behind a curtain at the end of the upstairs hallway. The attic was bigger than I'd expected, with dormer windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. And everywhere, covering every surface, were books and journals and papers covered in handwriting I was starting to recognize as family penmanship. Rosemary had been documenting everything. Detailed notes about which herbs grew best in which soil, when to plant and harvest, how to dry and store and prepare medicines that our grandmother had taught her and her grandmother had taught her. Recipes for tinctures and teas, salves and poultices, remedies for everything from headaches to heartbreak. I sat on the floor in that dusty attic and read for 3 hours, learning about a family history I never knew existed. Learning about women who'd been healers and herbalists and midwives, who'd carried knowledge forward through generations of being told that what they knew wasn't real medicine, wasn't real science, wasn't real anything. But the most shocking discovery was a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, correspondence between Rosemary and people all over the country. Doctors and researchers, herbalists and naturopaths, people who'd been quietly studying and documenting traditional healing methods while the rest of the world moved toward pills and procedures. A whole network of knowledge that I'd never known existed. The sun was setting by the time I made my way back downstairs, and I realized I hadn't thought about Michael or Sarah or senior communities for hours. I hadn't felt like a burden or a liability or someone who was taking up space. For the first time in 3 years, I'd felt like myself. My phone had been buzzing intermittently all day, but I'd been ignoring it. Now, sitting in Rosemary's kitchen, watching the last light fade over her wild gardens, I finally checked my messages. 7 texts from Michael, 3 missed calls from Sarah. 1 voicemail that started with, "Mom, where are you?" and ended with, "Please call me back. I'm worried." I called Michael from the kitchen landline, an old rotary phone that felt substantial in my hands. Mom? Jesus, where are you? Sarah said you left this morning without telling anyone where you were going, and you're not answering your cell phone, and... I'm fine, honey. I'm in Montana. Silence. Then, Montana? Mom, what are you doing in Montana? So I told him. About the lawyer's call, about Great Aunt Rosemary, about the inheritance I'd never expected. I told him about the house and the land and the gardens, about sitting in an attic reading family history I'd never known existed. Mom, this is crazy. You drove to Montana by yourself? Without telling anyone? What if something had happened to you? Then something would have happened. Michael, I'm 68, not 98. I'm perfectly capable of driving to Montana. But why? Why didn't you tell us about the inheritance? Why didn't you ask me to come with you? Because I needed to do this alone. Because I needed to prove to myself that I could still make decisions and take risks and trust my own judgment. Because I was tired of asking permission to live my own life. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, I needed to see it first, before I made any decisions about what to do with it. What kind of decisions? I don't know yet. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe I'll keep it. Maybe I'll move here. Another silence, longer this time. Mom, you can't be serious. Move to Montana? You don't know anyone there. You don't know anything about rural living. What about your doctors, your friends, your life here? What life? I wanted to ask. The life where your wife tells me I'm taking up space. The life where I'm a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. I haven't decided anything yet, I said instead. I'm just exploring options. Exploring options. He sounded like he was repeating the words to make sure he'd heard them correctly. Mom, can we please talk about this? Can you please come home so we can all sit down and discuss this like adults? Adults. There was that word again. Like I'd somehow stopped being an adult the day Harold died. Like my age had revoked my right to make my own choices. I'll be home tomorrow evening, I said. We can talk then. Promise me you'll drive carefully. Promise me you'll call if you need anything. I promise. And Mom, don't make any big decisions without talking to us first, okay? I hung up without promising that. I spent the night in Rosemary's house, in her bedroom with the 3 windows and the view of mountains. I lay awake listening to sounds I hadn't heard in years. Real quiet, broken only by wind and settling wood and some kind of bird calling in the distance. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors' televisions bleeding through thin walls. In the morning, I walked the property. 23 acres, according to the paperwork Mr. Peterson had given me. 23 acres of rolling meadow and wild gardens and possibilities I was just beginning to understand. There was a barn that could be restored, a greenhouse that needed new glass, raised beds that could be expanded and organized. And there was something else, something I hadn't noticed in yesterday's fading light. A spring bubbling up from the rocks near the back of the property, clear water flowing over stones and disappearing into the tall grass. Fresh water, clean water, the kind of resource that would be worth a fortune in the right hands. I knelt by the spring and cupped the water in my palms, tasted it. Cold and sweet and somehow familiar, like water I'd drunk in dreams. That's when I knew I wasn't going to sell this place. That's when I knew I wasn't going home to discuss options and make reasonable decisions and let other people plan my future for me. That's when I knew I was going to do something that would change everything. The drive home took longer than the drive out, partly because I stopped to take pictures and partly because I wasn't in any hurry to face what was waiting for me. I used the time to think, to plan, to prepare for conversations I knew weren't going to be easy. Michael's car was in my driveway when I pulled in, and I could see Sarah pacing in my living room through the front window. They'd been waiting for me, rehearsing their arguments, preparing their case for why I needed to be sensible. But I'd been rehearsing too, and I'd spent 11 hours each way thinking about what I wanted my life to look like, what I wanted to build with whatever time I had left. They were both sitting at my kitchen table when I walked in, looking like parents waiting to have a serious talk with a rebellious teenager. Sarah had papers spread out in front of her, printouts from senior community websites, listings for condos and assisted living facilities, maps showing distances to grocery stores and medical facilities. "Thank God you're home," Michael said, standing to hug me. We were so worried. "I told you I was fine." "Mom," Sarah said, and her voice was gentle in a way that immediately put me on guard. "We've been doing some research while you were gone. About this inheritance, about the practical implications of owning property so far away." She gestured to a sheet of paper covered in numbers. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance costs, utilities for a house that size. Even if you kept it as a vacation property, the annual expenses would be significant. Not to mention the condition it's probably in, Michael added. Rural properties that have been sitting empty for years usually need major repairs. Foundation issues, plumbing, electrical, roofing. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars just to make it habitable. I sat down across from them and looked at their carefully prepared case for why I should sell Great Aunt Rosemary's house and use the money for something more sensible, something more age-appropriate, something that wouldn't require me to change or grow or risk anything. "You're right," I said. "It would be expensive to maintain. It would need a lot of work. It's far from everything I'm familiar with." They both relaxed a little, thinking they'd won. "But I'm not selling it." The relaxation disappeared. Sarah's mouth opened like she was going to argue, then closed again. Michael frowned like he hadn't heard me correctly. "Mom, you just agreed that it's not practical." "I agreed that it wouldn't be practical if I wanted to keep living here and own property there too. But I don't want to keep living here." Silence. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes, right before words are spoken that can't be taken back. "I'm moving to Montana," I said. "I'm going to restore that property and live there." And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was taking up exactly the right amount of space. The explosion came exactly 3 seconds after I finished speaking. Sarah's face went through about 5 different shades of red before she found her voice, and when she did, it came out like a fire alarm. "Moving to Montana? Margaret, have you completely lost your mind? You're 68 years old. You can't just pick up and move to the middle of nowhere like some kind of pioneer woman." "Why not?" The question seemed to short-circuit whatever speech she'd prepared. Michael jumped in before she could recover. "Mom, be realistic. You've never lived anywhere but here. You don't know anything about rural living, about well water and septic systems and heating with propane. What happens when you need medical care? What happens when your car breaks down and you're 50 miles from the nearest mechanic? I guess I'll figure it out. People have been living in rural Montana for a long time without me there to help them." Sarah found her voice again. "This is exactly what I was talking about before. This is exactly the kind of impulsive, irresponsible decision-making that proves you need more support, not less supervision. Supervision. Like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with scissors." "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice level, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not asking for your permission." "Well, maybe you should be." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not just anger or frustration, but panic. Real, desperate panic. "What's really going on here?" I asked. "What aren't you telling me?" Michael and Sarah looked at each other, one of those married couple conversations that happens entirely with eye contact. He was shaking his head slightly. She was nodding, and I could see years of relationship dynamics playing out in the space between them. "Tell me," I said. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I'm pregnant." The words hit the room like a dropped glass, shattering something I hadn't even realized was fragile. I stared at her, at the woman who'd been telling me I was taking up too much space, who'd been trying to ship me off to a senior community, who'd been treating me like an expensive inconvenience. "How long have you known?" 3 months. 3 months. She'd been carrying my grandchild for 3 months and hadn't said a word. Had been planning my exile while growing my son's baby in her belly. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "Of course we were," Michael said quickly. "We were waiting for the right time, waiting to get past the first trimester. Waiting until after you'd convinced me to move into assisted living." Another one of those married couple eye conversations. This one lasted longer and ended with Sarah putting her face in her hands. "It's not like that," she said, her voice muffled by her palms. "It's just, we're scared, okay? We're scared about money and space and how we're going to manage everything. The baby's due in December, and our apartment is barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3. We've been looking at houses, but everything in our price range needs work. And with the baby coming, you thought if you could get me out of this house, you could move in here. Not immediately, Michael said, but eventually maybe. This place is perfect for a family, Mom. Big yard, good schools nearby, room to grow. Room to grow. Room for them to grow, while I withered away in some sterile facility where my biggest decision would be choosing between bingo and chair yoga. I looked at my son, really looked at him. 43 years old and still trying to make everyone happy, still trying to avoid the hard choices that might require him to disappoint someone he loved. I could see Harold in his face, the same weakness disguised as kindness, the same need to be liked that had sometimes made him agree to things he didn't really want. Michael, I said, do you want me to move into a senior community? I want you to be safe and happy. That's not what I asked. He stopped, started again. I want you to be my mom for as long as possible. I want to know you're taken care of. I want to not worry about you falling off stepladders or getting sick alone or having some emergency when nobody's around to help. And you think I can't have those things in Montana? I think Montana is 1,500 miles away from everyone who loves you. That stopped me. Because despite everything, despite the fighting and the manipulation and the attempts to manage my life, they did love me. Imperfectly, selfishly sometimes, but genuinely. What if it didn't have to be? I asked. What do you mean? I'd been thinking about this during the drive home, turning over possibilities like rocks in my hands. What if you came with me? Sarah's head snapped up. What? There's plenty of room. The house has 3 bedrooms, and there's space to build more if we needed it. 23 acres, Sarah. Room for gardens and workshops, and all the space a child could want to grow up in. Clean air, clean water, a community where people still know their neighbors. Move to Montana? Sarah said the words like I'd suggested we relocate to Mars. Margaret, I have a career. Michael has a career. We have lives here. You have jobs here. There's a difference. My job is my career. I've worked for 10 years to get where I am. And where is that exactly? Working 60-hour weeks for a company that would replace you in 30 seconds if their algorithm determined you were redundant? Missing your own pregnancy because you're too stressed to appreciate it? I hadn't meant to say that last part, but once it was out, I could see it land. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, a protective gesture that made her look younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. You don't understand, she said. You don't understand what it's like to build something from nothing, to work twice as hard as everyone else just to get taken seriously. Don't I? The question hung in the air between us. Because the truth was, I did understand. I'd worked part-time jobs for 20 years while raising Michael, fitting my ambitions around his school schedule and Harold's needs and everyone else's expectations of what a good wife and mother should prioritize. I'd built a life from nothing too, just not the kind of life that came with a salary and a title and recognition from strangers. The property I inherited, I said. It's not just a house. It's a working farm. Or it was, before it sat empty. Herb gardens, fruit trees, a spring with the cleanest water I've ever tasted. And there are records, Sarah. Journals and correspondence with people all over the country who are doing research on traditional medicine, on sustainable agriculture, on healing methods that have been working for centuries. I could see Michael's interest stirring, the same curiosity he'd shown as a child when I'd taught him which plants in our garden could ease a headache or settle an upset stomach. I'm thinking about starting a business, I continued, a retreat center. Somewhere people can come to learn about herbal medicine, to disconnect from technology, to remember what it feels like to live at a slower pace. There's a market for that, especially now when everyone's burned out and looking for alternatives to conventional medicine. A retreat center? Sarah's voice had changed, taken on the tone she used when she was calculating profit margins. What kind of market research have you done? What's your business plan? Your startup costs? I have 23 acres of prime real estate with water rights and existing agricultural infrastructure. I have 68 years of accumulated knowledge about healing and hospitality. And I have a network of experts who've been waiting decades for someone with the space and resources to create exactly this kind of place. It wasn't entirely true. I had the property and the knowledge, but the network was more potential than reality, and I had no idea what I was talking about regarding business plans and startup costs. But I could see Sarah's mind working, see her shifting from dismissive to calculating. "You'd need permits," she said. "Zoning approvals, health department clearances, insurance. You'd need to renovate for commercial use, install commercial-grade kitchen equipment, upgrade electrical and plumbing to handle larger groups." Yes, the upfront investment would be enormous, probably more than you could get from selling this house, even in today's market. Probably. You'd need investors, or partners. And there it was, the hook I'd been hoping for without quite knowing I was setting it. Partners who understood both the vision and the business side of things, I agreed. Partners who could handle marketing and booking and all the administrative details I've never had to learn. Michael was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. "Are you two seriously talking about going into business together?" "I'm talking about creating something meaningful," I said. "Something that honors the knowledge our family has carried for generations while building a sustainable future. Something that could support a family, maybe even multiple families, without requiring anyone to sacrifice their values or their health or their time with the people they love." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at the papers she'd brought to convince me to be reasonable. Financial projections for assisted living facilities, photographs of senior communities with their manicured lawns and scheduled activities and walls designed to keep the world at arm's length. "I'd want to see a full business plan," she said finally. "Market analysis, financial projections, detailed renovation estimates. I'd want to understand the legal requirements, the liability issues, the seasonal variations in tourism. Of course. And I'd want creative control over the marketing and branding, full authority over online presence, booking systems, customer relations. Absolutely." Michael was staring at both of us like we'd started speaking in tongues. "Are you serious? You're actually considering this? The baby changes everything," Sarah said, her hand moving to her stomach again. "I don't want to raise a child in the city, breathing polluted air and going to schools where they have to practice lockdown drills. But I also don't want to give up everything I've worked for just because I'm becoming a mother. This could be both," I said. "Rural living with professional opportunities, traditional values with modern income potential." "It's insane," Michael said. "It's possible," Sarah corrected. "Difficult, risky, probably more work than any of us can imagine, but possible." We spent the next 3 hours at my kitchen table, sketching out possibilities on the backs of Sarah's senior community brochures. Room layouts for guest accommodations, seasonal programming schedules, potential revenue streams from workshops and consultations, and retail sales of herbs and prepared remedies. It was after 10 when Michael finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air all evening. What about Dad's opinion in all this? I'd been wondering when Harold would enter the conversation. My dead husband, whose memory I'd been trying to honor by keeping everything exactly the way he'd left it. Whose ghost I'd been living with for 3 years, making decisions based on what he would have wanted, rather than what I wanted. Your father, I said carefully, loved adventure more than he loved security. He would have been packing the car already. It was true. Harold had been the one pushing for weekend camping trips and spontaneous road trips and home improvement projects that were way more ambitious than our budget could handle. He'd been the dreamer in our marriage while I'd been the practical one, keeping us grounded while he reached for possibilities I couldn't see. But would he have wanted you to move so far away from family? He would have wanted me to be happy. He would have wanted me to build something meaningful with my life instead of just maintaining what we'd already built together. Michael nodded slowly, and I could see him beginning to accept what had seemed impossible an hour earlier. There's something else, I said. Something I discovered in Montana that might make this whole thing more feasible than it seems. I told them about the spring, about the clear water flowing over ancient stones, about the soil quality and the existing herb gardens and the infrastructure that was already in place, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. And there's a neighbor, I added, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. A man named Daniel who runs an ecotourism business nearby. He's offered to help with permits and contractors, with understanding the local market. Sarah's eyebrows went up. A man named Daniel? A neighbor, I said firmly. Someone who understands the area and the business climate. A single neighbor? I didn't ask about his marital status, but I was lying, and we all knew it. I had asked in my roundabout way, and Daniel had mentioned being widowed 5 years earlier. I'd noticed the way he looked at me when he talked about the potential for herb gardens, the way his hand had lingered on my shoulder when he'd helped me navigate the uneven ground near the spring. "Mom," Michael said, and his voice was gentle. "Are you interested in this man? Romantically?" The question hung in the air like smoke, because the truth was, I didn't know. I'd spent 3 years thinking romance was something that belonged to my past, something that had died with Harold and been buried alongside him. But Daniel had made me feel something I'd forgotten I could feel. Interesting, capable, attractive in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with competence and vision. "I'm interested in building something meaningful with whatever time I have left," I said. "If that includes companionship, friendship, maybe even romance, then I'm not going to apologize for that or hide from it because other people think I'm too old for those feelings." Sarah reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. For the first time since I'd known her, the gesture felt genuine instead of calculated. "Margaret," she said, "I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on managing problems that I forgot you're not a problem to be managed. You're a person with your own dreams and desires and the right to pursue them." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. An acknowledgement that maybe we'd all been thinking too small, planning too carefully, letting fear make our decisions instead of hope. "So what happens now?" Michael asked. "Now we make lists," Sarah said, sliding into her professional mode. "Research, planning, concrete steps toward making this fantasy into a reality." "Now I call Daniel," I said, surprising myself with the decision, "and tell him I'm not just interested in his business advice." They both stared at me. "Mom," Michael started. "I'm 68 years old," I said. "I've spent 3 years being careful and practical and appropriate. I've spent 3 years making myself smaller so other people would be more comfortable. But if I'm going to start over, if I'm going to build something new, then I'm going to do it as myself. All of myself, including the parts that want companionship and adventure, and maybe even love." I stood up from the table, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I'm calling him tonight," I said, "and I'm going to ask him if he'd like to have dinner with me when I get back to Montana next week." "Next week?" Sarah said. "I have a business to plan and a life to start. I don't have time to waste being scared." And for the first time in 3 years, that was absolutely true.